September 1943. A prison camp outside Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The transport truck rumbled through the gates as guards watched from wooden towers, their rifles gleaming in the afternoon sun. Inside sat 30 German soldiers who had surrendered in North Africa, wearing tattered Afrika Korps uniforms, speaking broken English, carrying nothing but fear about what awaited them on American soil. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Among them sat Corporal Helena Schneider, a 24-year-old medic from a small village outside Munich. She had joined the Wehrmacht Medical Corps in 1941, believing the propaganda about defending her homeland. 2 years later, captured during the collapse of German forces in Tunisia, she found herself on a ship crossing the Atlantic, terrified of what Americans would do to their prisoners. The stories circulated among captured German soldiers painted dark pictures. Some said Americans executed prisoners immediately. Others claimed prisoners were worked to death in labor camps. A few whispered about torture and starvation. Helena had seen enough of war to know that armies committed atrocities. She had treated wounded soldiers who told stories about what happened in occupied territories. She understood that cruelty existed on all sides. Now, as the truck rolled deeper into the Kentucky countryside, she braced herself for whatever punishment awaited. The truck stopped outside a cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fences. Guards ordered the prisoners out, processing them one by one. Helena expected brutality, harsh treatment, the kind of reception she imagined enemy prisoners received everywhere. Instead, the American sergeant processing her intake asked simple questions in careful, slow English. Name, rank, unit, date of capture. He filled out forms with mechanical efficiency, showing neither hostility nor friendliness, just professional detachment. Another guard handed her folded clothes, a towel, a bar of soap. She was directed toward the women's section of the camp, a separate barracks where female prisoners of war were housed away from male prisoners. The barracks interior surprised her. Rows of metal beds with mattresses, thin but present, blankets folded at the foot of each bed, a wood stove in the center of the room, windows with glass, not just boards. It was Spartan, certainly, but it was not the hellish conditions she had imagined. That first night, Helena lay awake, listening to the sounds of the camp. No screams of tortured prisoners, no gunfire, just the ordinary sounds of a military installation, guards changing shifts, distant conversations, the wind moving through the trees surrounding the compound. The next morning began with what would become routine. Wake-up call at 6, roll call in the yard, breakfast in the mess hall. And that breakfast shattered every expectation Helena had carried across the ocean. The American guard opened the mess hall doors, and prisoners filed in to find tables set with metal trays. On each tray sat food that seemed impossible. Scrambled eggs, not the powdered substitute she had eaten in the Afrika Korps, but real eggs. Toast with butter, oatmeal with brown sugar. Coffee, actual coffee, not the ersatz grain mixture that passed for coffee in Germany. A small glass of orange juice. Helena stared at her tray, convinced this was some kind of test or trick. Around her, other prisoners reacted with similar disbelief. Some refused to eat, certain the food was poisoned. Others ate hesitantly, waiting for consequences that never came. Helena picked up her fork and tasted the eggs. They were real. She drank the coffee. It was genuine. She ate the toast with butter, something she had not tasted since before the war. By the end of that first breakfast, she understood something profound had shifted in her understanding of her captors. The days that followed established a pattern that contradicted everything she had been told about American prisoner camps.
3 meals daily, each containing more food than German civilians were receiving back home under rationing. Access to medical care in a camp infirmary staffed by American doctors and nurses who treated German prisoners with the same attention they gave American soldiers. work assignments that were supervised but not brutal, mostly maintenance tasks around the camp, gardening, kitchen duty, laundry. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. What Helena could not reconcile was the abundance. America was at war, fighting on multiple continents, supporting allies, equipping massive armies and navies and air forces. Yet the prisoners of war, enemy soldiers who had fought against American troops, received food that exceeded what German soldiers at the front were eating. The camp library confused her even more. Shelves filled with books in German and English, newspapers, admittedly censored but still available, educational materials for prisoners who wanted to study. The Americans provided paper, pencils, art supplies for those who wanted to draw or write. Some prisoners organized music groups, performing concerts with instruments the camp administration provided. The Red Cross inspections occurred regularly. International observers toured the facilities, interviewed prisoners without guards present, filed reports documenting conditions. Helena participated in one such interview, still cautious about speaking honestly, but the Swiss inspector asked detailed questions about food quality, medical care, living conditions, and treatment by guards. The inspector took notes, thanked her for her time, and moved on to the next prisoner. Weeks passed, then months. Helena worked in the camp infirmary, assisting American medical personnel. Her training as a Wehrmacht medic translated easily to the work. The American doctors treated her as a colleague once they recognized her competence. They discussed cases, asked her opinions, taught her new techniques. One afternoon in December 1943, a young American doctor named Captain Margaret Hayes sat down next to Helena during a break. They had worked together for several weeks, developing a professional rapport despite the language barrier and the circumstances that made one captor and one captive. Captain Hayes pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper and handed it to Helena. Inside was a wool scarf, hand-knitted in a deep blue color. Helena looked up, confused. Captain Hayes smiled and explained in simple English that it was a Christmas gift, that the cold Kentucky winter was harsh, that everyone deserved something warm. Helena held the scarf, feeling the soft wool, understanding that this small gesture represented something larger than simple kindness. This was an American officer giving a personal gift to a German prisoner, an enemy soldier, someone whose army had killed American soldiers. Yet here sat Captain Hayes, smiling, wishing her Merry Christmas in halting German she had clearly practiced. That evening, Helena wrote a letter home to her mother in Munich. The camp allowed prisoners to send mail through the Red Cross, censored but delivered. She described the food, the conditions, the treatment. She knew her mother would not believe it. She barely believed it herself. She wrote about the scarf, about Captain Hayes, about the profound confusion of being treated humanely by people she had been taught to consider enemies. Christmas Day 1943 brought another revelation. The camp administration organized a special meal for prisoners. Roasted turkey, something most German prisoners had never tasted. Mashed potatoes with gravy, vegetables, pie for dessert. The American guards served the meal, walking between tables with serving dishes, offering seconds to prisoners who wanted more food. Helena watched an American sergeant, probably 20 years old, serving turkey to German prisoners who months earlier had been shooting at American soldiers in North Africa. The sergeant smiled, wished them Merry Christmas in broken German, and moved on to the next table. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. In the women's barracks that night, prisoners talked quietly about what this treatment meant.
Some maintained it was propaganda, that Americans wanted to appear civilized to Red Cross inspectors. Others argued it was a trick, that the good treatment would end once the war turned against Germany. A few suggested something more disturbing to those who had believed Nazi ideology. Perhaps Americans were simply treating prisoners according to international law and basic human decency. Perhaps the stories about American brutality had been lies designed to make German soldiers fight harder rather than surrender. Helena lay in her bed, wrapped in the blue scarf Captain Hayes had given her, thinking about the 2 years she had spent believing Nazi propaganda. She had been told Americans were degenerate, weak, incapable of sacrifice. She had been told they were cruel to prisoners, that surrender meant death or slavery. She had been told that Germany fought for civilization against barbarism. Yet here she was, a prisoner in America, eating better than German civilians, receiving medical care, being treated with basic dignity. The contradiction forced her to question everything else she had been told. January 1944 brought new prisoners from the Italian campaign. They arrived with fresh stories of combat, of German defeats, and American military power. They also arrived with the same fears Helena had carried across the ocean. She watched them process through intake, saw their confusion at the conditions, recognized their disbelief at the first meals. She remembered her own shock just months earlier. Some of the new prisoners were younger, 17 and 18-year-old boys conscripted late in the war. They had been told they were defending Europe against invasion. Now they sat in a Kentucky prison camp, eating American food, sleeping in heated barracks, realizing they had been lied to about nearly everything. Helena began helping with new prisoner orientation, translating for those whose English was weaker, explaining camp rules and routines, answering questions about what to expect. She found herself in the strange position of reassuring terrified German soldiers that their American captors would not harm them, that the food was safe, that the medical care was real, that the treatment was genuine. She was telling them things she had not believed herself just months earlier. The work program expanded in spring 1944. Prisoners could volunteer for work assignments outside the camp, supervised labor on nearby farms that needed help because American farm workers had been drafted into military service. The pay was minimal, token amounts deposited in camp accounts, but the opportunity to leave the wire, to see the American countryside, to interact with American civilians appealed to many prisoners. Helena volunteered for a medical assignment, helping at a civilian clinic in a nearby town that had lost its only doctor to the war. The American authorities approved the assignment after reviewing her credentials and medical experience. Every Tuesday and Thursday, an army truck drove Helena and 3 other German prisoners to the small town of Clarksville, where they worked under supervision at the clinic. The town had perhaps 500 residents, mostly families of farmers and small business owners. The first day, Helena expected hostility. These were Americans whose sons and husbands were fighting in Europe. Their families were receiving telegrams about casualties. Why would they accept help from German prisoners? Yet when she arrived at the clinic, the elderly nurse who ran it in the doctor's absence greeted her with professional courtesy, showed her around the facility, explained what help was needed. Over the following weeks, Helena assisted with routine medical care. She helped treat a child with a broken arm, assisted with prenatal checkups for pregnant mothers, helped manage medication for elderly patients with chronic conditions. The nurse, whose name was Dorothy, treated her as a colleague, discussing cases, asking her opinions, teaching her about American medical practices that differed from German ones. The town residents initially kept their distance. They were polite but reserved, acknowledging her presence without warmth. Helena understood their position. She was the enemy. Their loved ones were fighting her countrymen. That some of those soldiers might die at German hands was a real possibility. She expected nothing more than cold professionalism. But humans are complicated creatures, and prolonged contact breaks down barriers. A farmer, whose daughter Helena helped treat for an infection, started nodding to her when she arrived at the clinic. A mother whose child Helena had comforted during a painful treatment brought her an apple pie one afternoon, saying nothing, just leaving it with a brief nod before departing. These small gestures accumulated over weeks and months. Not friendship exactly, but recognition of shared humanity. These Americans were not monsters. They were people worried about their families, struggling with wartime shortages, grieving for sons who would not come home. And Helena was not a Nazi fanatic or a mindless enemy. She was a young woman trained as a medic, trying to help where she could, caught up in circumstances beyond her control. The recognition of mutual humanity across enemy lines created a strange cognitive space where propaganda dissolved into reality. In June 1944, news of the D-Day invasion reached the camp. German prisoners gathered around radios, listening to reports of Allied forces landing in Normandy, pushing inland, fighting through French countryside toward Germany itself. The news brought mixed reactions. Some prisoners cheered secretly, hoping the war would end quickly regardless of outcome. Others felt despair, realizing Germany was losing. A few maintained faith that Germany would somehow prevail. Helena felt relief. Not joy at Germany's defeats, but relief that perhaps the war would end before more young men died on all sides. The American guards noticed the prisoners' reactions but said nothing. They maintained professional distance, neither gloating nor sympathizing. They were soldiers, doing their duty, guarding prisoners according to regulations and international law. Some were counting days until they could go home. Others had been classified as unfit for combat duty due to injuries or age. They did their job without drama or malice. Summer 1944 brought agricultural work assignments. Prisoners volunteered to help with harvests on nearby farms, picking vegetables, hauling produce, doing manual labor that American farms desperately needed. Helena continued her medical work but also participated in some agricultural assignments, wanting to experience more of America, to understand this country that had treated its prisoners so differently than she had expected. Working in the fields under Kentucky's sun, Helena talked with other prisoners about what would happen when the war ended. Some wanted to return to Germany immediately, to find their families, to rebuild their lives. Others expressed uncertainty about returning to a defeated Germany that would face occupation and judgment for Nazi crimes. A few quietly admitted they might try to stay in America if given the chance, to start over in a country that seemed to have opportunity and resources Germany would lack for years. The conversations were careful, mindful that guards might overhear, but the thoughts were real. What would await them in Germany after defeat? Cities destroyed by bombing, infrastructure shattered, economy collapsed, food shortages, occupation by foreign armies? The knowledge of what had been done in Germany's name, the camps that prisoners were beginning to hear about through newspapers and whispered conversations, the recognition that Germany had committed atrocities that would stay in the nation for generations. Returning to that seemed harder than staying in captivity in America, where at least there was food and shelter and a chance for something resembling normal life. By autumn 1944, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Allied armies advanced from east and west. German cities burned under bombing campaigns. The military situation deteriorated daily. In the prison camp, German prisoners followed the news with resignation. Some expressed hope that their families had survived the bombing. Others worried about Soviet forces advancing from the east, knowing the stories about Soviet treatment of German civilians. Helena worked through those months with steady focus, helping in the infirmary, continuing her assignments at the civilian clinic, building professional relationships with American medical personnel who increasingly treated her as a colleague rather than a prisoner. Captain Hayes asked her one afternoon what she planned to do after the war. Helena admitted she did not know. Returned to Germany, certainly, to find her mother if she had survived the bombing of Munich, but beyond that, Germany would be occupied, destroyed, facing years of rebuilding. What opportunities would exist for a young woman who had been a Wehrmacht medic? What kind of life could she build in the ruins? Captain Hayes listened thoughtfully, then suggested Helena consider staying in America, that there would be programs for displaced persons, that her medical training could be valuable. The suggestion surprised Helena. She was an enemy soldier. Why would America want her to stay? Captain Hayes explained that America needed medical professionals, that the country valued skills and hard work regardless of background. that immigration programs existed for those who could contribute. The conversation planted a seed in Helena's mind, the possibility of a future she had not considered. Winter came again, her second winter in captivity. Christmas 1944 brought another elaborate meal, another reminder of the abundance that characterized American treatment of prisoners. Helena had grown accustomed to the food quality, the medical care, the basic human dignity. What had shocked her a year earlier now seemed routine. But the normalization of decent treatment carried its own revelation. This was not special circumstances or propaganda. This was simply how America operated, even toward enemy prisoners during wartime. The new year brought news of Germany's final collapse. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate offensive, had failed. Soviet forces were pushing toward Berlin from the east. American and British forces crossed the Rhine from the west. Every day brought reports of German cities falling, German units surrendering, the Third Reich crumbling. In the prison camp, German prisoners faced the reality that their homeland was being conquered, occupied, destroyed. Some felt relief that the war was ending. Others felt despair at Germany's defeat. Most felt anxiety about what would happen to their families. Helena received a Red Cross message in February 1945. Her mother was alive, living in the ruins of Munich, working in a makeshift hospital treating civilians wounded in the bombing. The news brought tears of relief. Her mother had survived. But the message also described the conditions, the destroyed buildings, the food shortages, the chaos of a collapsing society. Her mother was alive, but living in circumstances that sounded desperate. Helena wrote back immediately, describing her situation, the camp conditions, the food, the medical work. She knew her mother would barely believe the letter. How could a German prisoner in America be eating well while German civilians in Munich were starving? The contradiction highlighted the fundamental difference between the two societies. America, fighting a global war on multiple fronts, still had resources to feed enemy prisoners well. Germany, fighting defensively on its own soil, could not feed its own civilians adequately. The disparity revealed something about industrial capacity, agricultural production, economic systems, fundamental differences in how the two nations organized themselves and their resources. In March 1945, newspapers in the camp began carrying stories about concentration camps being discovered as Allied forces advanced into Germany. The reports described conditions that seemed impossible: systematic murder on an industrial scale, gas chambers, mass graves, deliberate starvation. German prisoners reacted with disbelief, denial, anger at what they insisted must be propaganda. Helena read the reports with growing horror. She had known about labor camps, about harsh treatment of prisoners, but systematic extermination? The deliberate murder of millions? The scale of the atrocities described in the newspapers seemed beyond comprehension. The American guards watched the German prisoners process this information. Some guards showed contempt, anger at prisoners who denied the evidence. Others showed something closer to pity, recognizing that most of these prisoners had been ordinary soldiers who had not known the full extent of Nazi crimes. The guards maintained professional distance, but the atmosphere in the camp shifted. German prisoners were no longer just enemy soldiers. They were members of a nation that had committed unprecedented atrocities.
She had served in the Wehrmacht Medical Corps. She had treated wounded soldiers, not participated in combat. But she had worn the uniform of a regime that had committed mass murder. She had believed some of the propaganda, supported some of the policies, served the military that enabled the atrocities. How much responsibility did she bear? How much guilt? Where was the line between individual culpability and collective shame? Captain Hayes found her sitting alone in the infirmary one afternoon, staring at nothing. The captain sat down beside her, saying nothing at first, just offering presence. Finally, Helena spoke in halting English, asking how Americans could treat German prisoners decently when they now knew what Germany had done. How could Captain Hayes work alongside a German medic, share coffee, exchange medical knowledge, when German doctors had conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners? Captain Hayes considered the question carefully before responding. She explained that America followed the Geneva Convention not because enemies deserved good treatment, but because civilized nations maintain standards regardless of what enemies do. That treating prisoners humanely was not about the prisoners deserving it, but about Americans choosing to be the kind of people who maintain decency, even in war. That holding individuals responsible for their own actions while recognizing that not every German was personally guilty of atrocities was how justice worked. That Helena, who had served as a medic treating wounded soldiers, was not the same as SS guards who ran death camps. The distinction mattered. The conversation did not resolve Helena's guilt, but it provided a framework for understanding. She could not change what Germany had done. She could not undo the crimes committed in her nation's name. But she could choose her own actions going forward. She could choose to be someone who helped others, who lived according to principles of decency and compassion, who tried to make amends through how she lived rather than drowning in collective guilt. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich ceased to exist. In the prison camp, German prisoners received the news with mixed emotions: relief that the killing had stopped, despair at Germany's total defeat, anxiety about what would happen next, fear for families still in Germany under occupation, uncertainty about their own futures. The American authorities began processing prisoners for eventual repatriation. The logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of German prisoners from camps across America to a defeated, occupied Germany would take time, months, perhaps years. In the meantime, prisoners continued their routines, working their assignments, living their lives in captivity while the world outside reorganized itself. Helena continued her medical work, both in the camp infirmary and at the civilian clinic. The work provided purpose, structure, a sense of contributing something useful. Dorothy, the elderly nurse who supervised the clinic, had become something close to a friend despite the circumstances. They worked together efficiently, communicated easily despite language differences, shared a professional respect that transcended national boundaries. One afternoon in June 1945, Dorothy asked Helena what she planned to do when she returned to Germany. Helena described her uncertainty, the destroyed cities, the food shortages, the occupation, the limited opportunities. Dorothy listened, then made a suggestion. She was retiring soon, needed someone to take over the clinic. Would Helena consider staying in America, completing whatever certifications were needed, taking over the medical practice? The offer stunned Helena. This was an American civilian offering a German prisoner an opportunity to build a life in America, to practice medicine, to become part of the community. Dorothy explained that the town needed medical help.
Helena had proven herself competent and trustworthy. Her being German mattered less than her skills and character. If she wanted to stay, Dorothy would help navigate the immigration process. Helena lay awake that night considering possibilities she had never imagined. Stay in America? Build a life in the country that had been her enemy? Leave Germany behind, not just temporarily, but potentially forever? The ideas seemed both impossible and strangely appealing. What awaited her in Germany? Ruins, poverty, occupation, shame, years of hardship rebuilding a destroyed nation that would bear the stain of Nazi crimes for generations. What awaited her in America? Opportunity, resources, a chance to use her medical training helping people who needed care, a future that was not defined by Germany's past. The choice was not simple. Her mother was in Germany, assuming she survived the occupation's early months. Her home, her language, her culture were German.
Could she really abandon all that to stay in America? But staying did not mean abandoning her identity. German immigrants had been coming to America for generations. They maintained their culture while building new lives. She could be both German and American, carrying her heritage while embracing new opportunities. Over the following weeks, Helena discussed the possibility with Captain Hayes, with Dorothy, with other German prisoners who faced similar choices. Some prisoners were determined to return to Germany regardless of conditions, to be with their families, to participate in rebuilding their homeland. Others were considering staying in America if opportunities existed, recognizing that their skills and labor were needed in a country that had not been physically destroyed by war. The American government began establishing programs for German prisoners who wanted to stay. Not all prisoners qualified. Those with SS affiliations or evidence of war crimes were excluded. Those with needed skills, clean records, and American sponsors could apply for immigration status. Helena qualified. Her medical training was valuable. Her conduct as a prisoner had been exemplary. She had American sponsors willing to vouch for her. Dorothy's offer of employment provided the necessary documentation. In August 1945, Helena submitted her application to remain in the United States after her prisoner of war status ended. The processing would take months. In the meantime, she continued her work, saved her token wages, studied English more intensively, prepared for a future that seemed increasingly likely. News from Germany continued to be grim. Her mother's letters described destroyed cities, severe food shortages, displaced populations, and the psychological weight of occupation and collective guilt. The letters made clear that Germany would struggle for years, that rebuilding would be slow and painful, that opportunities were scarce. Her mother encouraged Helena to stay in America if the chance existed, to build a good life rather than returning to hardship. The blessing from her mother eased Helena's guilt about choosing to stay. She was not abandoning her family. She was accepting an opportunity that her mother recognized and endorsed. Autumn 1945 brought changes to the camp. Some prisoners were repatriated to Germany on early transports. Others waited for their turn, knowing it might be months or years before they returned. Those applying to stay in America existed in a strange limbo, still technically prisoners, but increasingly treated as immigrants awaiting approval. Helena's application progressed through bureaucratic channels. She was interviewed multiple times by immigration officials who asked about her service record, her political beliefs, her reasons for wanting to stay. She answered honestly, explaining that she had been a medical corporal who treated wounded soldiers, that she had never been a Nazi Party member, that she saw greater opportunities in America than in destroyed Germany. The officials seemed satisfied. Christmas 1945 marked her third Christmas in captivity, but this one felt different. The war was over. Germany had been defeated. She was no longer an enemy prisoner, but an immigrant applicant waiting for approval. Dorothy invited her to Christmas dinner at her home, a small farmhouse outside Clarksville.
Helena accepted nervously, her first time in an American civilian home as a guest rather than a prisoner. The dinner was simple but abundant. Turkey, vegetables from Dorothy's garden, bread, pie. Dorothy's sister and brother-in-law joined them, farmers from the next county. The conversation was awkward at first, a language barrier and the circumstances creating uncertainty. But Dorothy's warmth broke down barriers. She introduced Helena as her colleague from the clinic, the talented medic who would take over the practice when she retired. The framing shifted how the others saw Helena, not a German prisoner, but a medical professional, not an enemy, but a colleague. The conversation flowed more easily after that. They discussed the clinic's needs, the community's medical challenges, plans for expanding services. By the end of the evening, Helena felt something she had not experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of being welcomed, of having a place in a community. In January 1946, Helena's immigration application was approved. She was granted permanent residency in the United States based on her medical training, her clean record, and her employment offer. Her prisoner of war status officially ended. She was now a civilian immigrant, free to live and work in America. The transition from prisoner to immigrant happened with bureaucratic simplicity. She turned in her prisoner identification, received new immigration papers, moved out of the camp barracks into a small room Dorothy had arranged above the clinic. The physical change was minimal. She had been working at the clinic for over a year, but the psychological change was profound. She was no longer a captive. She was a resident, building a life. The medical licensing requirements took time to navigate. Her German medical training was solid, but American certification required additional study and examinations. Dorothy helped guide her through the process, providing study materials, explaining American medical practices, preparing her for the licensing exams. Helena studied intensively while continuing to work at the clinic under Dorothy's supervision. The town of Clarksville gradually accepted her presence. She was no longer the German prisoner who helped at the clinic. She was Dorothy's assistant, the medic who treated their children, the young woman working hard to build a life in their community. Some residents never fully accepted her. They had lost sons or brothers in the war and could not separate her from Germany's crimes. Helena understood. She did not demand acceptance. She simply did her work, helped where she could, lived quietly and competently. Over months and years, most came to judge her by her actions rather than her nationality. In spring 1946, Helena passed her medical licensing exams. She was now legally qualified to practice as a medical assistant in Kentucky, with the possibility of further training to become a fully licensed nurse or physician. Dorothy began transitioning the clinic's operations to her, teaching her about the business side of running a medical practice, introducing her to patients as the person who would take over their care. The transition was gradual but steady. By summer 1946, Helena was effectively running the clinic with Dorothy serving as advisor and consultant. She treated routine illnesses, managed chronic conditions, handled minor emergencies, referred serious cases to the hospital in the county seat. The work was demanding but fulfilling. She was using her training to help people, making a tangible difference in lives, building professional relationships with patients who trusted her care. Dorothy officially retired in December 1946, turning the clinic over completely to Helena. The transition was emotional for both women. Dorothy had spent 30 years running the clinic. Helena had spent 3 years transforming from terrified prisoner to confident medical professional. They had built a genuine friendship across the barriers of language, nationality, and circumstance. The friendship demonstrated what Helena had learned during her captivity, that individuals could transcend political divisions through shared work and mutual respect, that humanity existed independent of nationality, that building relationships across enemy lines was not only possible, but valuable. As Helena settled into her new role as the clinic's primary medical provider, she reflected on her journey. 3 years earlier, she had arrived in America terrified of execution or brutal imprisonment. Instead, she had been fed well, treated decently, given opportunities to work and learn. She had been shown that enemies could be treated humanely without compromising security. She had learned that decent treatment of prisoners was not weakness, but strength, not naivety, but confidence in one's own values. The American approach to prisoner treatment had not made sense to her at first. Why feed enemy soldiers better than your own civilians? Why provide medical care and education to people who had fought against you? Why treat prisoners according to international law when enemies might not reciprocate? But over time, she understood. Treating prisoners well was not about the prisoners. It was about maintaining one's own principles regardless of circumstances. It was about being the kind of society that follows its stated values, even when challenged. It was about demonstrating through actions, rather than propaganda, that your system was genuinely better.
The contrast between American prisoner treatment and what she knew about German camps was stark. The difference revealed fundamental values about human dignity, rule of law, and basic decency. America had resources that Germany lacked, certainly, but beyond resources was choice. America chose to treat prisoners according to international law, even when it was expensive and difficult. That choice said something important about American values. Helena became an American citizen in 1951, 5 years after receiving permanent residency. The naturalization ceremony was simple, held at the federal courthouse in Louisville. She raised her right hand and swore allegiance to the United States, renouncing allegiance to any foreign prince or state. She received her citizenship certificate, shook the judge's hand, walked out as an American citizen. The transformation from enemy soldier to American citizen had taken 8 years. 8 years of work, study, building relationships, proving herself and earning trust. 8 years of learning English fluently, understanding American culture deeply, and contributing to her community meaningfully. She had earned her place through effort and character. Her mother visited in 1953, traveling from Germany for 3 months to see what life her daughter had built. The visit was joyful and bittersweet. Her mother was proud of Helena's accomplishments, but showed the wear of living through war and occupation. Germany was recovering slowly. The Marshall Plan was helping rebuild infrastructure and industry, but the psychological weight of Nazi crimes and the division of Germany into occupation zones created ongoing challenges. Her mother toured the clinic, met Dorothy, saw the practice Helena had built. She met patients who spoke warmly of Helena's care. She saw the comfortable apartment Helena rented, the professional respect Helena had earned, the life Helena had created. By the end of the visit, her mother understood why Helena had chosen to stay. The opportunities in America far exceeded what Germany could offer, especially for someone who had worn the Wehrmacht uniform. Helena continued running the clinic for 3 decades, eventually training younger medical professionals who took over when she retired in the 1970s. She married an American veteran in 1955, a man who had fought in the Pacific Theater and understood the complexities of war and reconciliation. They built a quiet life together, raised 2 children who grew up American with German heritage, and contributed to their community through decades of steady work. The story of her captivity and choice to stay became known in the community over time. Some found it inspiring, evidence of America's capacity to transform enemies into citizens through decent treatment and opportunity. Others remained skeptical, unable to fully trust someone who had worn the enemy uniform. Helena accepted both reactions. She could not change her past. She could only live her present according to principles of service and decency.
Looking back on her life in her later years, Helena recognized that her experience as a prisoner of war had been extraordinary not because it was unusual, but because it reflected American commitment to principles even under the stress of war. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners had been held in American camps during the war. Nearly all had been treated according to Geneva Convention standards. Most had been fed well, housed adequately, provided medical care. The treatment had not been perfect. There had been incidents, failures, exceptions. But the general pattern had been decent treatment according to international law. That pattern had changed lives. Many German prisoners who returned home carried positive impressions of America that influenced post-war Germany's development. Some stayed in America, like Helena, becoming citizens and contributing to American society. The decent treatment of prisoners during World War II stood in stark contrast to other conflicts and other nations' approaches. It demonstrated that maintaining principles during war was possible with sufficient commitment and resources. It showed that treating enemies humanely did not weaken security, but potentially strengthened post-war relationships. It proved that individuals could transcend national conflicts through personal relationships built on mutual respect and shared work. Helena's journey from Wehrmacht medic to American citizen and medical professional illustrated these principles through one woman's life. Her story was not unique. Thousands of German prisoners made similar choices, built similar lives, contributed similarly to American society. But each individual story mattered. Each life transformed through decent treatment validated the American commitment to maintaining principles even when fighting enemies. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.